Story Part 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and checked her rifle one final time. The year was 2004, and the Iraqi city had become a battleground where American forces faced determined insurgents in brutal urban warfare. Sarah had been deployed for 6 months, serving as a combat medic with the 1st Marine Division during some of the fiercest fighting of the Iraq War. At 23 years old, Sarah had volunteered for combat duty against the advice of her family back in Ohio. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had tried to talk her out of joining the Marines, but Sarah felt a calling to serve her country and help wounded soldiers on the front lines. She had completed her medical training at Camp Pendleton and arrived in Iraq with determination burning in her chest and a heavy medical pack on her back. The mission that October morning seemed routine by Fallujah standards. Sarah's unit was tasked with clearing a residential sector where intelligence suggested insurgents were using civilian homes as weapons caches and staging areas for attacks on coalition forces. The neighborhood had been relatively quiet for several days, which made everyone nervous. In Fallujah, quiet usually meant trouble was brewing. Sarah's squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, briefed the 12-person team on their objectives. They would move house to house, searching for weapons and gathering intelligence, while providing medical support to any wounded civilians they encountered. Sarah's role was crucial. She would stay close to the point men, ready to treat injuries from improvised explosive devices, sniper fire, or close-quarters combat. As the squad moved through narrow alleyways lined with concrete walls and metal gates, Sarah felt the familiar weight of her medical supplies. Her pack contained everything needed to save lives: bandages, morphine, tourniquets, chest seals, and IV fluids. She had used these supplies dozens of times over the past months, treating both Marines and Iraqi civilians caught in the crossfire of urban warfare. The first 3 houses yielded nothing significant: some old ammunition, a few propaganda leaflets, and frightened families who cooperated with the search. Sarah helped treat a young Iraqi boy who had cut his foot on broken glass, carefully cleaning and bandaging the wound while his mother watched with grateful eyes. These moments of human connection reminded Sarah why she had chosen to serve as a medic rather than in a purely combat role. By mid-morning, the squad approached the 4th house on their list. The building stood 3 stories tall with small windows and a flat roof, typical of Iraqi architecture. Intelligence reports indicated this residence might be connected to a local insurgent cell that had been responsible for several roadside bomb attacks in recent weeks. Sergeant Rodriguez signaled for the team to take positions around the building, while he and 2 other Marines prepared to enter through the front door. Sarah positioned herself behind a concrete barrier about 30 meters from the house, close enough to reach wounded Marines quickly, but far enough to avoid the initial danger of room-clearing operations. The Marines knocked on the door and announced their presence in Arabic, following standard protocol for civilian areas. When no one answered after several attempts, they prepared to breach the entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as Rodriguez tried the door handle and found it unlocked, another red flag in a city where families typically secured their homes against both insurgents and coalition forces. As the 1st Marine stepped across the threshold, Sarah noticed movement in the windows of neighboring buildings. Something felt wrong about the entire situation. The street was too empty, even for a war zone. No children played in the dirt roads, no women hung laundry from rooftops, and no men gathered in doorways to smoke and talk, as was common in residential areas. Rodriguez disappeared into the darkness of the house with 2 Marines behind him. Sarah adjusted her grip on her rifle and scanned the surrounding rooftops through her scope. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then the radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, reporting that the ground floor was clear and they were moving to the 2nd level. Sarah's training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that they were walking into a trap. She keyed her radio to warn Rodriguez, but before she could speak, the quiet morning exploded into chaos. The sharp crack of rifle fire erupted from multiple directions, and Sarah realized with growing horror that her squad had been surrounded by insurgents who had spent days preparing an elaborate ambush in the heart of Fallujah. Story Part 2. Gunfire erupted from every direction as Sarah dove behind the concrete barrier, her heart pounding against her chest. Muzzle flashes lit up windows in buildings surrounding the target house, and the distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper boom of RPGs exploding against walls and vehicles. The insurgents had turned the entire neighborhood into a killing field, with overlapping fields of fire that trapped the Marines in a deadly crossfire. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio from inside the house, reporting that his team was pinned down on the second floor by heavy enemy fire. Sarah could hear the panic in his voice as he described insurgents moving through the building below them, cutting off their escape route. The 3 Marines were effectively trapped in an urban fortress that had become their prison. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall as bullets chipped away at the barrier above her head. Through the chaos, she could see 2 of her fellow Marines lying motionless in the street, their bodies sprawled in unnatural positions. One was Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, who had shown her pictures of his girlfriend just that morning. The other was Corporal Davis, a father of 2 who had been planning to leave the Marines after this deployment. The weight of her medical training pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. Every instinct told her to stay hidden behind the barrier where she had some protection from the incoming fire. But her oath as a medic demanded that she reach the wounded Marines who needed immediate medical attention to survive. In combat medicine, the difference between life and death often came down to minutes or even seconds. Sarah forced herself to assess the tactical situation with the clarity her training had drilled into her. The insurgents had positioned themselves in a roughly circular pattern around the Marines, using buildings and rooftops to create interlocking fields of fire. Any movement in the street would draw immediate attention from multiple shooters armed with automatic weapons. But Johnson was moving slightly, which meant he was still alive and bleeding out in the open street. Sarah could see a dark stain spreading across his desert camouflage uniform, indicating a serious wound that would prove fatal without immediate treatment. She estimated the distance at about 50 meters of completely open ground, with no cover except for a few scattered pieces of concrete debris. The radio exploded with frantic communications as the squad members tried to coordinate their response to the ambush. Some Marines had found cover behind vehicles, while others were trapped in doorways and alleys with limited fields of fire. The unit's heavy weapons specialist reported that his machine gun had jammed, leaving them without their most effective tool for suppressing enemy positions. Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time, ensuring that everything was secure and easily accessible. She had treated gunshot wounds before, but never under such intense enemy fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared tourniquets and pressure bandages, knowing that she would have only seconds to stop Johnson's bleeding once she reached him. Through her radio earpiece, Sarah could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching. Close air support was en route. But it would take precious minutes for the aircraft to arrive and identify enemy positions without hitting friendly forces. Johnson might not have minutes to spare if his wounds were as serious as they appeared from Sarah's position. The decision came suddenly, without conscious thought or elaborate planning. Sarah simply stood up from behind the concrete barrier and began running toward Johnson's motionless form in the middle of the street. Her legs pumped frantically as she zigzagged between pieces of debris, trying to present a difficult target for the insurgent shooters, who immediately focused their attention on her movement. Bullets whistled past Sarah's head, with sounds like angry wasps, striking the ground around her feet and sending up small explosions of dust and concrete fragments. She could hear her fellow Marines shouting over the radio, some ordering her to get back to cover, while others provided covering fire to suppress the enemy positions, targeting her desperate rescue attempt. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah covered the distance to Johnson's position. She could see his eyes were open and alert, which gave her hope that his wounds might not be immediately fatal. But the blood stain on his uniform continued to spread, indicating internal bleeding or damage to major blood vessels that would require immediate surgical intervention to repair. Sarah reached Johnson and immediately began her assessment while still under heavy enemy fire. A quick examination revealed 3 gunshot wounds, 1 in his left shoulder, 1 in his abdomen, and 1 in his right leg. The abdominal wound was the most serious, with signs of internal bleeding that would prove fatal within minutes without proper medical treatment. Working with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around her, Sarah applied pressure bandages to the wounds, while simultaneously establishing an IV line to replace Johnson's lost blood volume. The young Marine was conscious, but going into shock from blood loss. His skin was pale and clammy, despite the desert heat. As Sarah worked to stabilize Johnson's condition, she realized with growing horror that they were both completely exposed in the middle of the street, with no cover from the continuing enemy fire. The insurgents seemed to understand that she was a medic and were concentrating their efforts on preventing her from saving the wounded Marine's life. Every second that passed brought more bullets closer to their position, and Sarah knew that their luck could not hold out much longer. Story, Part 3. Sarah worked frantically over Johnson's wounded body as bullets continued to crack through the air around them. She had managed to slow the bleeding from his abdominal wound, but the young Marine was slipping deeper into shock with each passing second. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and his pulse was weak but racing as his body fought to circulate what blood remained. The insurgents seemed to realize that killing the American medic would demoralize the entire squad and prevent her from treating other wounded Marines. Sarah could hear the enemy fighters shouting to each other in Arabic, coordinating their fire to trap her in the open street where she knelt beside Johnson's motionless form. Through her radio earpiece, Sarah heard Sergeant Rodriguez's voice from inside the target building. His team had fought their way to the roof, but were still pinned down by heavy fire from surrounding positions. He was trying to direct covering fire to help Sarah and Johnson reach safety, but the Marines' ammunition was running dangerously low after continuous combat. Sarah knew she had to move Johnson to cover, but the nearest safe position was a damaged car about 30 meters away. The young Marine had lost too much blood to walk, which meant Sarah would have to drag his dead weight across open ground while under direct enemy fire. It was a nearly impossible task, but staying in their current position guaranteed death for both of them. As Sarah prepared to move Johnson, she heard a new sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round grew louder until it exploded about 50 meters away, sending a shower of concrete fragments and steel shrapnel in all directions. The insurgents were bringing up heavier weapons to finish off the trapped Marines. Sarah grabbed Johnson under his arms and began dragging him toward the damaged car, her muscles straining against his weight and her own heavy medical equipment. The young Marine was semi-conscious and tried to help by pushing with his good leg, but his strength was fading rapidly from blood loss. Halfway to the car, Sarah felt something slam into her right shoulder with tremendous force, spinning her partially around and nearly causing her to lose her grip on Johnson. She had been shot, but adrenaline and training kept her moving, even as warm blood began soaking through her uniform. The bullet had passed through the soft tissue without hitting bone, leaving her arm partially functional. More mortar rounds began falling around the street as the insurgents adjusted their aim. Sarah could see other members of her squad trying to reach covered positions while laying down suppressing fire. But the enemy had prepared this ambush with military precision. Every escape route was covered by multiple shooters, and the Marines were being systematically isolated and destroyed. Sarah finally reached the damaged car and pulled Johnson behind its bulk, giving them protection from most of the enemy fire. But she could see that the vehicle's fuel tank had been punctured by gunfire and was leaking gasoline onto the ground. If a tracer round or RPG hit the car, it would explode and kill them both instantly. Working quickly despite her wounded shoulder, Sarah reassessed Johnson's condition. The bleeding had slowed thanks to her pressure bandages, but he needed immediate surgery to survive. His pulse was growing weaker, and his skin had turned an alarming shade of gray that indicated severe blood loss and impending organ failure. The radio crackled with reports from other squad members. 3 Marines were confirmed dead, including Corporal Davis, whom Sarah had seen fall in the initial ambush. 5 others were wounded to various degrees, and ammunition was running critically low across the entire unit. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah realized they might all die in this Fallujah street unless help arrived soon. Sarah tried to contact their base to request immediate medical evacuation, but enemy fire had damaged the squad's primary radio. She could hear fragments of transmissions from other units in the city, but could not establish clear communication with their headquarters. The Marines were effectively cut off from outside support in the middle of a carefully planned enemy ambush. As if responding to her thoughts, Sarah heard the sound of helicopter rotor blades approaching from the south. 2 attack helicopters appeared over the rooftops, their door guns already firing at identified enemy positions. The arrival of air support gave the Marines new hope, but Sarah knew that close air support could not solve their immediate medical crisis. Johnson's breathing had become so shallow that Sarah had to put her ear to his chest to confirm he was still alive. She had done everything possible with her field medical training, but the young Marine needed blood transfusions and emergency surgery within the next few minutes to survive his wounds. Sarah made another desperate radio call, this time using Johnson's personal radio, which had survived the initial ambush. After several attempts, she managed to establish contact with a medical evacuation team that was standing by at the main base. But the medevac pilots reported that the landing zone was too hot for a helicopter approach with current enemy fire. The attack helicopters continued their gun runs, systematically destroying the buildings where insurgents had positioned themselves. Each explosion sent debris flying through the air, and Sarah could see enemy fighters abandoning some positions to escape the aerial assault. But the helicopters could not eliminate all the threats without risking civilian casualties in the densely populated neighborhood. As Sarah held pressure on Johnson's wounds and watched his life slowly ebbing away, she heard a sound that filled her with both hope and terror. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the gunfire and explosions, came the distinctive sound of heavy gunfire from American weapons. Another Marine unit was fighting its way toward their position, but Sarah feared they would arrive too late to save Johnson or the other wounded Marines bleeding out in the Fallujah streets. Story Part 4. The sound of approaching gunfire grew louder as Sarah continued applying pressure to Johnson's wounds behind the damaged car. She could distinguish the sharp crack of American M4 rifles, mixed with the deeper boom of grenade launchers, indicating that a substantial Marine force was fighting its way through the neighborhood toward their trapped position. Johnson's eyes fluttered open briefly, and he tried to speak through lips that had turned pale from blood loss. Sarah leaned closer to hear his whispered words about his girlfriend back home and his fear that he would never see her again. She squeezed his hand and assured him that help was coming, though she privately wondered if either of them would survive the next few minutes. The insurgents seemed to realize that their ambush was being broken by the approaching Marines, and their fire became more desperate and inaccurate. Sarah could see enemy fighters abandoning their prepared positions in nearby buildings, some carrying wounded comrades as they retreated deeper into the neighborhood. The attack helicopters continued their devastating gun runs, systematically destroying the weapons positions that had trapped the Marine squad. Through her radio, Sarah finally established clear contact with the approaching relief force. Captain Martinez was leading 2 full squads of Marines, supported by an armored vehicle, and they were less than 2 blocks away from Sarah's position. But the captain warned that they were facing determined resistance from insurgents who had prepared multiple defensive positions throughout the area. Sarah looked around the damaged car to assess the tactical situation. Several of her squad mates had managed to reach better cover and were still returning fire at enemy positions. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came over the radio from the target building, reporting that his team had finally fought their way back to the ground floor and were preparing to rejoin the main unit. But the delay was proving costly for Johnson, whose condition continued to deteriorate despite Sarah's medical efforts. His pulse was now barely detectable, and his breathing had become irregular and labored. Sarah knew from her medical training that the young Marine was entering Babel, entering the final stages of hypovolemic shock caused by massive blood loss. A tremendous explosion shook the ground as the armored vehicle supporting Captain Martinez's relief force destroyed an enemy machine gun position with its main cannon. Sarah could see smoke and debris rising from a building 3 blocks away, and the volume of enemy fire directed at her position decreased noticeably as the insurgents shifted to face the new threat. Sarah made a desperate decision that went against all tactical doctrine. She stood up from behind the car and began signaling with her arms toward the approaching Marines, making herself a target, but potentially saving precious time in locating the trapped squad. Enemy bullets immediately began striking the ground around her feet, but she continued waving until she saw return signals from the relief force. Captain Martinez's voice crackled over the radio, confirming that he had visual contact with Sarah's position and was directing his assault toward the buildings that still contained active enemy fighters. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of American machine guns laying down suppressing fire, creating a wall of bullets that forced the remaining insurgents to keep their heads down. The first Marines from the relief force appeared at the end of the street, moving in tactical formation with weapons raised and eyes scanning for threats. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she recognized the desert camouflage uniforms and the methodical way the Marines cleared each potential danger area before advancing to the next position. But her relief was short-lived as a new wave of enemy fire erupted from a building Sarah had thought was abandoned. The insurgents had held some positions in reserve, waiting for the rescue force to expose themselves before opening fire. Sarah protective perimeter around the improvised landing zone. Sarah watched as Johnson was loaded onto the aircraft, along with 2 other critically wounded Marines from her squad. The flight medic aboard the helicopter gave her a thumbs-up signal, indicating that Johnson was still alive. As the aircraft lifted off toward Baghdad, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as she watched the helicopter disappear over the Fallujah rooftops. She had done everything within her power to save Johnson's life, but the final outcome would depend on the trauma surgeons waiting at the military hospital. Her wounded shoulder throbbed with increasing intensity now that the adrenaline of combat was beginning to wear off. Captain Martinez approached Sarah as his Marines secured the area and searched for any remaining enemy fighters. The captain was a veteran of multiple deployments who had seen many urban battles, but even he seemed shaken by the intensity and coordination of the ambush that had trapped Sarah's squad. He informed her that intelligence analysts believed the attack had been planned for weeks by insurgent leaders who had studied American patrol patterns. Sarah learned the full cost of the morning's battle as Martinez briefed her on casualties. 4 Marines had been killed in the initial ambush, including Corporal Davis and Private Thompson. Both men Sarah had treated for minor injuries on previous missions. 7 others had been wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, while several more had minor wounds that could be treated at the forward operating base. The tactical situation in Fallujah was deteriorating rapidly. Martinez explained that insurgent forces had demonstrated a new level of coordination and planning that suggested involvement by former Iraqi military officers with professional training. The enemy was no longer conducting simple hit-and-run attacks, but was instead organizing complex operations designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. Sarah accompanied Martinez's Marines as they conducted a detailed search of the buildings used by insurgents during the ambush. They discovered extensive preparations, including pre-positioned ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment. The enemy fighters had planned to hold their positions for an extended battle, indicating sophisticated intelligence about American response times and tactics. In the target building where Sergeant Rodriguez's team had been trapped, Marines found evidence of a weapons cache that included advanced explosives and sniper rifles. Sarah realized that her squad had walked into a carefully prepared kill zone where every detail had been planned to maximize American casualties while minimizing insurgent losses. The psychological impact of the ambush affected different Marines in various ways. Some became quieter and more cautious, while others seemed energized by having survived such intense combat. Sarah found herself thinking constantly about Johnson and the other wounded Marines, wondering about their condition and whether her medical treatment had been adequate under such extreme circumstances. Back at the forward operating base, Sarah received treatment for her shoulder wound from the medical staff. The bullet had passed through soft tissue without hitting major blood vessels or nerves, but the wound required careful cleaning and antibiotic treatment to prevent infection. The doctor who examined her commented on the amount of blood on her uniform, not realizing that most of it belonged to the Marines she had treated during the battle. Sarah spent the evening writing detailed reports about the ambush for intelligence analysts who were trying to understand the new enemy tactics being employed in Fallujah. Her account of the battle would be studied by other Marine units operating in the area, helping them prepare for similar attacks in the future. News of Johnson's condition arrived the next morning through official channels. The young Marine had survived the helicopter flight to Baghdad and was undergoing emergency surgery to repair internal injuries caused by the abdominal gunshot wound. Doctors described his condition as critical but stable, meaning he had a reasonable chance of survival if no complications developed during his recovery. Sarah felt a tremendous sense of relief at the news about Johnson, but she also experienced unexpected guilt about the Marines who had died in the ambush. She replayed the battle in her mind, wondering if she could have done something differently to save more lives, or prevented the enemy from achieving such a devastating tactical success. The psychological counselors at the base explained that survivor guilt was a common reaction among combat medics who faced impossible choices during battle. Sarah's actions had undoubtedly saved Johnson's life, and possibly the lives of other wounded Marines. But the emotional toll of losing friends and squad mates was a burden that many combat veterans carried for years after their service ended. Fallujah continued to be a dangerous assignment for American forces, with daily contact between Marine patrols and insurgent fighters. Sarah's unit was assigned to a different sector of the city, but she knew that the lessons learned from the ambush would shape their tactics and procedures for the remainder of their deployment. Sarah wrote letters to the families of the Marines killed in the ambush, describing their courage and sacrifice during the battle. These letters were among the most difficult tasks she had ever undertaken, but she felt obligated to ensure that the families understood how bravely their sons had fought in the streets of Fallujah. The wounded shoulder limited Sarah's physical capabilities for several weeks, but she continued serving as the squad's medic while it healed. She found herself more cautious during patrols, constantly scanning for signs of prepared ambush positions and listening for the subtle sounds that might indicate enemy movement in the urban environment. 3 weeks after the ambush, Sarah received news that Johnson had been transferred from the military hospital in Baghdad to a medical facility in Germany for continued treatment and rehabilitation. His wounds were healing properly, and doctors expected him to make a full recovery despite the severity of his injuries during the battle in Fallujah. Story, Part 6. 2 months after the devastating ambush in Fallujah, Sarah Mitchell had settled into the routine of combat operations in one of Iraq's most dangerous cities. Her wounded shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of that terrible morning when her squad walked into the carefully planned insurgent trap. She continued serving as a combat medic, but the experience had changed her approach to urban warfare in subtle but important ways. Sarah's new squad operated in a different sector of Fallujah, conducting house-to-house searches and establishing temporary checkpoints to disrupt insurgent movement throughout the city. The tactical lessons learned from the ambush had been incorporated into standard operating procedures, with Marines now conducting more thorough reconnaissance before entering potentially dangerous areas. The psychological impact of losing 4 squad mates continued to affect Sarah in unexpected ways. She found herself more protective of the Marines under her medical care, sometimes taking additional risks to ensure their safety during combat operations. Her fellow Marines noticed her increased vigilance and began relying more heavily on her medical expertise and tactical judgment. Sarah received occasional updates about Johnson's recovery through the military medical system. The young Marine had undergone multiple surgeries to repair internal damage from his wounds, but doctors remained optimistic about his long-term prognosis. He was scheduled to return to the United States for continued rehabilitation at a military medical center, where he would begin the long process of returning to normal life. Intelligence reports indicated that the insurgent cell responsible for the ambush had been significantly weakened by subsequent military operations. Several key leaders had been killed or captured, and their weapons caches had been destroyed by Marine raids throughout the city. But Sarah knew that other enemy groups would quickly move to fill the vacuum left by the eliminated cell. The urban warfare in Fallujah continued to evolve as both American forces and insurgent fighters adapted their tactics to counter enemy capabilities. Sarah observed how the enemy had learned to avoid direct confrontations with heavily armed Marine units, instead focusing on improvised explosive devices and sniper attacks that could inflict casualties while minimizing their own losses. Sarah's reputation as a skilled combat medic spread throughout her battalion, leading to requests for her to accompany special operations teams on high-risk missions. These assignments often involved working with Navy SEALs and other elite units that required medical support during complex urban operations against high-value insurgent targets. During one such mission, Sarah found herself working alongside a SEAL team that was conducting surveillance on suspected insurgent safe houses in a particularly dangerous neighborhood of Fallujah. The SEALs operated with a level of precision and tactical sophistication that impressed even experienced Marines like Sarah, who had months of combat experience in the city. The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, briefed Sarah on their current mission parameters. Intelligence analysts had identified a building complex that served as a logistics hub for insurgent operations throughout the region. The SEALs would conduct reconnaissance to confirm enemy activity and gather intelligence about weapons shipments and operational planning. Sarah's medical expertise proved valuable during the 3-day surveillance mission, as team members developed minor injuries and illnesses that could have compromised their operational effectiveness. She treated everything from infected cuts to dehydration, while maintaining the noise discipline essential for avoiding detection by enemy forces in the surrounding area. The mission provided Sarah with insights into how Special Operations Forces conducted urban warfare differently from conventional Marine units. The SEALs emphasized stealth and intelligence gathering over direct confrontation, using advanced technology and specialized training to achieve objectives while minimizing their exposure to enemy fire. During the surveillance operation, Sarah learned that the building complex they were watching had been connected to the insurgent cell responsible for the ambush that had nearly killed Johnson and claimed the lives of 4 Marines from her original squad. The realization that she might be involved in operations against the same enemy fighters who had caused so much death and suffering filled her with mixed emotions. Lieutenant Commander Hayes noticed Sarah's reaction when she learned about the connection to her previous combat experience. The SEAL officer had read her after-action reports from the ambush and understood the personal significance of the current mission. He assured her that professional detachment was essential for effective military operations, but acknowledged the natural human desire for justice. The surveillance mission concluded successfully, with the SEALs gathering detailed intelligence about insurgent operations and identifying several high-value targets for future military action. Sarah's medical support had contributed to the mission's success by ensuring that all team members remained physically capable of performing their specialized duties. Sarah returned to her regular Marine unit with a new appreciation for the complexity of military operations in urban environments like Fallujah. The experience with the SEAL team had demonstrated how different military specialties could work together to achieve objectives that would be impossible for any single unit to accomplish alone. News arrived that Johnson had been medically retired from the Marines due to complications from his wounds, but was expected to make a full recovery and return to civilian life. Sarah felt satisfaction knowing that her medical treatment during the ambush had contributed to saving the young Marine's life and giving him the opportunity to build a future beyond military service. Sarah's deployment in Fallujah was scheduled to end in 3 months, after which she would return to the United States for leave, before potentially deploying to Afghanistan with another Marine unit. The experience in Iraq had taught her valuable lessons about combat medicine and urban warfare that would serve her well in future assignments. But she looked forward to a brief respite from the constant dangers of combat operations. Story Part 7. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, 2 days before Sarah was scheduled to board a transport plane back to the United States after completing her tour in Fallujah. She had been sleeping fitfully in her bunk at the forward operating base when the communications specialist shook her awake, explaining that there was an urgent call for her from an unknown number. Sarah stumbled to the communications tent, wondering who would be calling her at such an unusual hour. The voice on the other end of the secure line was unfamiliar, but carried the crisp authority of a military officer. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the SEAL team leader she had worked with during the surveillance mission, was calling to request her immediate assistance with an urgent operation. Hayes explained that his SEAL team had been tasked with a high-priority mission to capture or eliminate the insurgent leader who had planned the ambush that killed 4 Marines from Sarah's original squad. Intelligence sources had located the target at a compound outside Fallujah, and the operation was scheduled to commence within 6 hours. The team needed a combat medic, and Hayes specifically requested Sarah due to her experience and proven performance under extreme combat conditions. Sarah felt her heart racing as Hayes described the mission parameters. The insurgent leader, known by the code name The Engineer, had been responsible for planning multiple attacks against American forces throughout the region. His capture would significantly disrupt enemy operations and potentially save the lives of many American soldiers and Marines serving in Iraq. The SEAL team would infiltrate the compound using helicopter insertion, conduct a direct action raid to capture or kill the target, and extract with any intelligence materials discovered during the operation. Sarah's role would be to provide medical support for the team and treat any wounded enemy personnel who might provide valuable intelligence information. Sarah realized that this mission offered the opportunity to directly confront the enemy leader responsible for the deaths of her fellow Marines. The personal connection to the target made the assignment both professionally significant and emotionally charged, but her medical training emphasized the importance of treating all wounded personnel regardless of their allegiance. Hayes gave Sarah 30 minutes to prepare her medical equipment and report to the helicopter landing zone, where the SEAL team was assembling for the mission. She quickly gathered her combat medical supplies, focusing on trauma care equipment that would be essential for treating gunshot wounds and blast injuries during a high-intensity raid operation. The helicopter flight to the target compound took place in complete darkness, with the aircraft flying at extremely low altitude to avoid detection by enemy air defense systems. Sarah found herself seated between two heavily armed SEAL operators who reviewed the mission plan one final time, using night vision equipment and detailed satellite photographs of the objective area. The compound consisted of 3 buildings, surrounded by high walls and guard towers, typical of the fortified positions used by high-value insurgent targets throughout Iraq. Intelligence reports indicated that the engineer was meeting with other insurgent leaders to plan future attacks against American forces, making this a time-sensitive opportunity to eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. Sarah checked her medical supplies one final time as the helicopter approached the landing zone, about 2 kilometers from the target compound. Her equipment included advanced trauma care items that were not typically available to conventional Marine units, including specialized medications and surgical instruments designed for treating critical injuries in combat environments. The SEAL team moved through the darkness with practiced silence, using night vision equipment and hand signals to communicate while approaching the compound. Sarah stayed close to the team leader, ready to provide immediate medical support if any team members were wounded during the assault phase of the operation. The assault began with explosive charges that breached the compound walls simultaneously at multiple points, creating confusion among the enemy defenders while giving the SEALs multiple entry routes. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of suppressed weapons as the team systematically cleared each building while searching for the engineer and other high-value targets. Within minutes, the SEALs had secured the compound and captured 3 insurgent leaders, including the engineer himself. The raid had proceeded with remarkable efficiency, but 1 SEAL operator had been wounded by shrapnel from an enemy grenade that exploded during the final moments of resistance. Sarah immediately began treating the wounded SEAL, who had sustained multiple fragment wounds to his legs and lower torso. The injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, requiring careful removal of metal fragments and treatment for blood loss. She worked quickly while the rest of the team secured intelligence materials and prepared for extraction. The engineer had been wounded during the capture operation, and Sarah found herself treating the same insurgent leader who had planned the ambush that nearly killed Johnson and claimed the lives of 4 Marines from her original squad. Despite her personal feelings about the man's responsibility for American casualties, her medical training required her to provide the same level of care she would give to any wounded person. As Sarah worked on the engineer's wounds, she looked into the eyes of the man who had caused so much death and suffering among her fellow Marines. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his 30s, with the lean build and calloused hands of someone who had spent years fighting in the urban environment of Fallujah. The extraction helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, and Sarah helped load both the wounded SEAL and the captured insurgent leaders onto the aircraft for transport back to the forward operating base. The mission had been completed successfully, with minimal American casualties, representing a significant tactical victory against enemy forces in the region. During the flight back to base, Sarah reflected on the strange circumstances that had brought her face to face with the engineer. Her deployment in Iraq was ending with the capture of the man responsible for one of the most traumatic experiences of her military service, providing a sense of closure that she had not expected to achieve. The intelligence materials recovered during the raid revealed extensive information about insurgent operations throughout the region, leading to additional military operations that disrupted enemy activities and saved American lives. Sarah's medical support during the mission had contributed to its success and demonstrated the importance of skilled combat medics in special operations. 2 days later, Sarah boarded the transport aircraft that would carry her back to the United States after months of combat operations in Fallujah. She carried with her the memories of fallen comrades, the satisfaction of lives saved through her medical skills, and the knowledge that her service had contributed to the broader mission of protecting American forces and Iraqi civilians from terrorist violence. Years later, Sarah would learn that Johnson had fully recovered from his wounds and returned to civilian life, eventually becoming a paramedic in his hometown. The engineer had provided valuable intelligence that led to the capture of other insurgent leaders, significantly reducing enemy attacks against American forces in the Fallujah region. The circle of violence and healing that had defined Sarah's deployment in Iraq was finally complete. The story of Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell in Fallujah teaches us a profound life lesson about courage, duty, and the resilience of the human spirit. Sarah's unwavering commitment as a combat medic, risking her life under relentless enemy fire to save Private Johnson, embodies the essence of selflessness. Despite being wounded herself, she pushed through fear and pain, driven by her oath to save lives. Her actions remind us that true heroism lies not in the absence of fear, but in acting despite it, especially when others depend on us. This story also highlights the emotional weight of survivors' guilt and the psychological toll of war, showing that healing, both physical and emotional, requires immense strength. Sarah's journey, from the chaos of an ambush to facing the insurgent leader responsible, underscores the power of perseverance and the pursuit of justice, tempered by compassion. Her ability to treat even the enemy with care reflects a deep humanity that transcends conflict. This narrative inspires us to find purpose in our struggles, to act with integrity under pressure, and to honor those who sacrifice for others. We invite you to reflect on Sarah's story and share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons resonate with you? How have you faced challenges with courage in your own life? If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of resilience and hope, connecting us through the universal language of human experience. Let's keep the conversation going. Comment now and become part of our journey.